Yeah.
seemed to me that we've seen these, like in almost every election, there's somebody who kind of vaguely talks like an old New Deal Democrat. There's someone who comes along and wants to, like the Two Americas with John Edwards, or Dennis Kucinich might have been someone like that before. What was it about Sanders that made him more important in your mind before Trump in 2016?
Yeah, I think there was a far sharper level of class delineation in what he was expressing. This is someone who, it's like actually this is sometimes reminds me of the history of the Civil War. If you know a little bit about the Civil War, but just like the 5-second version, is a war about slavery. If you like spend a couple years learning about it in high school, you say, oh, it's pretty complicated. It's about 5 different factors and whatever else, Then if you're a real student of history and you spend years of your life poring over this stuff and, whatever else, then you say, oh yeah, it was about slavery. I feel like with Sanders, he was someone who was a man of the left and a man of the far left. This was someone who was an elector for the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1980s, who did, as Mayor of Burlington, even like later on when he had moved into more mainstream politics, a more important figure, express solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and become involved with solidarity work with struggles in Nicaragua and El Salvador. This is someone who has views of the far left. He's modulated some of those views, but I think there's this old left common sense, class centric quality to him.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Bhaskar Sunkara is an American political writer. He's the founding editor of Jacobin, the president of The Nation, publisher of Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy, and of the London Tribune. He is a good acquaintance of mine. He's been helpful lately, and I'm glad to have him on to talk about the left and about publishing on the left and about the aftermath of what seemed like a socialist moment. Before I even start, though, I want to tell you, I want to ask you a question and set it up. So, have you ever seen the movie After Hours?
No, I have not.
At the beginning of that movie, there's a character who's played by a guy who played Balky on television years ago. And he starts talking to the main character about his dream. And he says, all I want to do is I want to start a magazine for intellectuals that are being excluded. I think that, I could really get into publishing. And the main character just completely tunes him out. He's like a joke. And and when I saw that in the 80s, I thought, oh my God, I'm a cliche. But I wanted to, so that's the setup. Did you have that dream of starting a magazine and being a publisher for the people who weren't getting published when you were starting out?
Yeah, I would say not really. I mean, to be honest, I was probably even more highly ideological than I am now. So that my goal was really to help advance a set of politics than to be involved with the same group of people that I had been involved broadly, doing activism with the Democratic Socialists of America, with Young Democratic Socialists, with kind of other types of activism too, and to use the platform of a website to communicate views that were at times heterodox, but communicate views and to kind of win over the left and reinvigorate the left at the same was. Like, I didn't know that there was such a title as publisher really until very close to the release, and basically just by looking at the other mastheads of other publications. But to me, it wasn't the goal was a little bit more crass and vulgarly political.
Well, I don't know if it's crass or just not as narcissistic as the goal of the publisher or the artist. But I think that's an interesting answer, not one I would have expected. So when you started out, you'd already kind of formed your ideological commitment. So tell me about how that came to be. How did you become a Marxist and committed to that kind of left politics?
Well, I became a socialist maybe pretty young in my teenage years, like 13 or 14 years old. And I would say that I became a socialist largely for, I was attracted at first to a broadly social democratic vision in the sense of believing in the welfare state, seeing the advantages that the state played in my family's own, to some degree, upward mobility. My three oldest siblings didn't get a chance to go to college. I was at a pretty young age, put on the college track. I was the only one born in the US. I benefited from good public school district, good public libraries, whatever else. And at the time, the center of gravity was such in the US, there was nothing really to the left, it seemed, of like Paul Krugman or Jon Stewart in the mainstream. So I kind of had those commitments. And then kind of randomly, I became attracted to the left, the kind of Marxist left, because of a study of history. So I read at a pretty young age Eric Hobsbawm. I read the Deutscher trilogy. I really was attracted to the figure of Trotsky, and I, as a historical figure. I also kind of dabbled in some work from Ralph Miliband, but more importantly, in my development part, Michael Harrington, Irving Howe to some degree. So this is an unusual kind of random intellectual thing for a high schooler who was otherwise fairly normal. I like to think maybe. But I would say that the two things were almost separate. One was a bread and butter commitment to the welfare state, unions, and whatever else, and the other was a intellectual attraction to Marxism. And obviously I wanted a way to reconcile the two, because we all want a Marxist worldview, but also a socialist politics that's actually relevant and that could fight and that doesn't seem like a defeated good idea. And I guess a lot of my intellectual evolution was finding discarded and defeated ideas and seeing the relevance and utility of them. So I was, particularly when I was late in high school and in college, I was attracted to kind of the pushback against postmodernism and the cultural turn, attracted to, the more kind of vulgar the Marxist rendition, the better, just because I thought it was correcting for something important. I became involved with the Democratic Socialists of America, the Young Democratic Socialists, late in high school, my senior year of high school.
What year would that have been?
This is probably 2007. I think I joined April 2007. I graduated from high school June 2007, and I started Jacobin the summer in between my sophomore and junior year of college. So that was 2010. So pretty early on, I had formed roughly my worldview, and I was obviously influenced by the small core of people around the Young Democratic Socialists. People like Chris Maisano, Peter Fraze. There's a handful of people who were active and still are, but are featured, especially in, many of them are still contributors today, but especially in the early issues of Jacobin. That's kind of the extension of this publication that I helped edit for the Young Democratic Socialists, which was called The Activist. And I was the editor from maybe 2008 until maybe 2009, 2010.
So did you started out by telling me you weren't that interested in being a publisher, really, that it was all about politics. What about writing? Was that why were you drawn to being a journalist and writing before your politics, or at the same time as your politics? Did you see writing as your way to be political?
Yeah, I thought that if in doubt, if there was a period of defeat, it was best to write and propagandize and kind of, do that instead of just the trap of like actionism. Yeah, so I felt like an attraction to that. The only thing was based on my age, I was 20, just turning 21 when I started Jacobin, so I was not equipped to be a very good writer. So I have the opening editorial. I have this piece, Why We Love the Zapatistas, in issue 1 of Jacobin that I did the interviews in issue 1 of Jacobin, like one with Walter Ben Michaels. And I think actually intellectually they're fine, politically at least they're fine, stylistically and otherwise. I was aware of my limitations, I would say. So I figured out kind of how to become an editor, really, first and foremost. How to work on simplifying academics' rhetoric, how to try to make things a little bit more punchier, how to try to attract readers that weren't already on the left. And obviously at some point that combined with managing circulation, trying to build circulation, what not just an editor, but a publisher does. But I would say that I definitely thought, maybe this is too self-aggrandizing, but I definitely thought that I could have been and would have been a strong writer over time, but instead it was kind of the premature development of Jacobin that led me more in the direction of figuring out editing and publishing. And to be a good editor, obviously, a lot of what you need is just general knowledge and knowing how to ask the right questions, but you're not necessarily going to zero in and be a specialist or whatever else. You're just working with a bunch of specialists and coordinating the kind of symphony. So I felt like that was the easier thing to learn and easier to pick up at a younger age without many years of kind of, training and experience compared to, have more heavy duty intellectual work, which I still haven't attempted, luckily.
I came to discover Jacobin as a writer because I was writing short stories. I'd written a novel, I think, and I wanted to become a more political writer, and I looked at Jacobin as a potential place to publish. And the first time I ever wrote to you guys, I had my agent write to you and say, do you guys pay anything? And it was a dumb move. But I remember you and N+1 kind of came across my radar at the same time. Did those two publications come up at the same time, or is that just around the same time? Was there a relationship between N+1 and Jacobin in the early days, or is that a false association in my mind?
I would say that there was an opportunistic relationship between Jacobin and the existing kind of coterie of little magazines in New York, whereas a lot of those magazines, especially N+1, were getting media buzz when we were just started. And I thought that a good way for us to grow, at least part of growing our profile and attention, was to be associated with those publications. I think there's a lot to like, especially about that period of N+1, just in terms of the quality of the writing, in particular. So it's clearly a very talented writers. Many of them, like Ben Kunkel, I think really, really do have left commitments, and we're generally just friendly people. But mostly, despite the kind of the appreciation for the form, there wasn't kind of a deep connection, if that makes sense. Because I think the people around Jacobin came from a different universe and always considered what we were doing much more directly political. And that was our niche. And then when we launched our series with Verso, we had Ben Kunkel brought his series of essays, to Verso and to us, because that was his move from, he had done literary books. This was a more, directly political set of essays. So we were the natural home for that, if that makes sense. Yeah. So it was a positive relationship, but there wasn't that much overlap. And I think I saw Jacobin as much closer to a version with different politics of Dissent or Monthly Review, in that was meant to be a journal, but it was meant to be accessible and aiming to create a kind of political center around it.
I want to remind you that Gcas is Sublation Media's one and only sponsor. They are an educational institution offering accredited degrees, and they are running seminars in critical theory, psychoanalysis, communication, philosophy, and literature. Upcoming seminars include Rocky Gangle on Spinoza's ethics, Keith Faulkner's seminar on the genealogy of ideas, including lectures on Nietzsche, Foucault, and Deleuze, Emma Lee Russin on George Bataille's Religion Without Religion, and many others. If you're interested in a radical education, follow the link to Gcas in the description. Supporting Gcas is a good way to support Sublation Media.
And it's funny when, Hal Draper talks about the concept of a political center in his writing. He cites not only various Trotskyist groupings that had tried to form a broad non-party political center in a period of relative decline for the left, but he talked about a social democratic center around dissent that had formed, and also he might have described it as like quasi-Maoist, or I don't know what descriptor he used for it, but another center that had formed around Monthly Review or The Guardian, which was obviously a very important publication on the left for a time in the 70s and 80s. So I think that's where I considered the debating ground for Jacobin, not really ever as a literary project.
Well, it strikes me that you started Jacobin after Obama had been elected, right? And I'm a bit older than you considerably, and I remember left publications kind of having the quality of Z Magazine on the one hand, or in a less serious kind of like something like Anarchy Magazine or the newspapers, the various newspapers. There was Adbusters, which,
I remember all those well. And actually, I started reading the Z Magazine maybe in like 2006, 2007, because it was mentioned in, I don't know if you ever watched the documentary version of Manufacturing Dissent.
Yeah.
I think it was like around then, but they had like a long part of the third act, which is probably not great filmmaking, but it was like, at least for me, it was like, oh, Chomsky says read this thing called Z Magazine. I should check it out and check out Michael Albert.
Right. Yeah. And I now years and years later, after seeing that same movie, know Michael Albert, but published him at Zero Books, and it's amazing. And Michael Albert's still out there doing work, but Jacobin came along and was just really different from what had been going on before. It's very different. Didn't have the same quality as Z Magazine at all. It didn't have the same quality as Adbusters, which was kind of anarcho, hippie, art school kind of quality. And I wondered, how much do you think what allowed you to come into being and to do what you were doing was a change in the left that had to do with the election of Barack Obama? Or do you think that's true?
No, I would actually, I think that a lot of it was I honestly think it was more voluntaristic than that. I just think that it was a generational thing of having fresh eyes and wanting to do something that seemed a little more accessible and just spoke in a different language, just based on coming from younger people. And obviously, I don't put much stock in generational politics as a substantive thing, but I just mean as a communicative thing.
Right.
And knowing how to, build a social media presence, knowing how to reach people and to, move towards relevance, while at the same time not really changing the content towards relevance. If you look at the early issues, there's not a lot of it is very clear where our intellectual interests are and the things we're talking about, and we're not really following, trends. And I think that was the initial instinct, was to be fresher and to avoid the nostalgia, and I think the biggest addition was a little bit more than a year in. Rumike Forbes, who's now our publisher, came on to design Jacobin and be our creative director. In a sense, before long, basically, our publisher as well in a certain sense. And what he brought aesthetically and otherwise, I think had a major factor in how we were perceived, because we weren't really actually read that much before our.
When was that?
So right around the Occupy movement, he came.
I mean, I was just going to say, you can try to be voluntaristic, but then you look at that, the moment where.
The moment where we grew was really, Occupy a year later, a late year after we launched. But I think the actual, setting up was very much a, it seemed to me that it was more or less the same people we had at The Activist. And to the extent we brought on more people in those new issues, it was people like Richard Seymour and Lars Lee, I think, made an appearance in an early issue, Walter Michaels. So it was not different content, really.
No, right. But you were suddenly taken up by a left that was engaged with, was disaffected by the Obama administration's failure to cope adequately with the economic crisis. And I don't know who would have been able to adequately cope after 2008. And the rise, Occupy was a refutation by the left of the Obama administration, amongst a lot of other things.
Yeah, I think it was, but to some extent we were tailing Occupy, obviously, in part because the initial impulse and the initial precursor to Occupy, I think, was very much came out of the anarchist movement in particular. I think in its tactical orientation, it was far more anarchistic than socialist. And to me, kind of represented perhaps like the last gasp of energy stemming from the anti-globalization movement of the late 90s and onward. It obviously drew on things like the New School occupation and the struggles in the UC movement. It kind of had some of that spirit. The only thing is, like, the reason why I think it got popular resonance was it was a sign that broad egalitarian anti-austerity politics had mass support. So I think the reason why it mattered was it's broadly socialist or social democratic, if you want to put it that way, impulses that, but its tactical orientation, we had no idea. I mean, a lot of us, I went to Occupy soon after it started, because I went to school in DC, but my family's all in New York, so I was there pretty early on. I was willing to go along with it, but I was like, this is kind of ludicrous as an idea, and whatever else, and that's a good humbling reminder of how we're on we sometimes are. Yeah.
Well, in 2020, when after the murder of George Floyd, and there were massive protests that erupted that dwarfed Occupy in this country. And from my vantage point, now I'm in the Pacific Northwest, when kids that were trying to keep the George Floyd movement going, the abolish the police movement going, when they were trying to create a movement for radical change out of that what they picked up were anarchist books. And the forms that they embraced were anarchist. Certainly in the Pacific Northwest, but I think largely there was a feeling that direct action, anarchist self-organization was what was called for in a moment of massive riots. And it seems like in America, maybe especially, but maybe across the board, I don't know. The anarchists are always the ones that are coming in moments of crisis to sort of shape the political response of what calls itself the left, and then it peters out into.
Well, how about just saying that at a time when the left was discredited or seemed old and defeated, the anarchists were the ones willing to just take action, to just do things, and not to use this word again, but do things in a voluntaristic way that actually didn't make sense. Whereas we were trying to assess the balance of forces. And
Right.
I don't know if you remember the One Nation rally that the unions put on in like 2010, but I had more hope for maybe spring 2011. I had more hope for that One Nation rally. Even as like as a socialist, as a Marxist, I was like, okay, this is the broad, front, and from this, there's going to be an anti-austerity movement to counter the Tea Party, and from that, mass trade union and left progressive back movement, we're going to be able to carve out a socialist, flank. It was a very rigid kind of view where the anarchists were like, let's sit in a bunch of squares, right? And I think that even theoretically, part of the attraction of, let's say, going back to 99 Empire by Hart and Negri, a lot of the John Holloway, a lot of kind of the post-Marxism books, the attraction of the coming insurrection, which I think was 2008. 2008, yeah.
I mean, it was probably came out in 2007 or 6, but then became a big deal around 2008, and even was sort of in the air in 2011 and around Occupy.
I think it's vagueness were strengths, and even Crime Think was like this. It's like you're reading poetry. You're not reading some description about how to follow the Cuban road, because the thing about socialism is that it does have a history, it does have a track record, it does have a form connected to the mass party, it does have something that could be just very direct, like what we're trying to do, at least in theory. And at a certain time, I think that directness and that politicalness was less sexy than kind of vague post-political theories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for sure. In the 90s, that defines the 90s to a T. The anarchists dominated, not just because I was in the Pacific Northwest, but I think after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and really longer ago than that, there was a feeling like what we need is, I remember the band Crass?
Yeah.
And I did a reading in New York at the Blue Stockings with the G. Voucher, who was the illustrator for all their albums and kind of a member of the band. And I was like, I think we need to get beyond this notion of like, we can just imagine a new tomorrow. Like maybe we need to shape some sort of vanguard and who can think these things through. And she was like, can you do it? I was like, well, I don't know, probably not. And she said, then shut up. Just imagine, we don't want any of this. Basically, she didn't want any of the politics. I like her a lot. Her art's great, but I know exactly what you're talking about. So I want to ask you, like, when you start, I want to ask you about 2016, about how you were involved in the DSA, which was not the big force that it is now. It was not thought of as being where the left was going to go. Did you think that the DSA was going to explode when you got involved with it? Do you have a prediction of that? Or were you just lucky that Trump got elected?
No, I think that, I think part of the first wave of growth in DSA, I think a lot of us, not me as an individual, but a lot of us who were involved in the organization at 5,000 people, growing it to 10 or 15,000, I think was really the product of just, to some extent, obviously, even before Bernie, it was a product of just savvy organizing, hard work, a lot of people starting things on campus and kind of just doing the basic common sense organizing to build a base. To some degree, Occupy helped a little bit. Then obviously with Bernie, I think we jumped to like maybe 15, 20,000. And then after that, it exploded with Trump. I did not anticipate that. What I thought I was doing by being a member of DSA was I thought, all right, if you're a socialist, you should be a member of a socialist organization. DSA is flexible and ecumenical enough, and I didn't think was doing anything kind of barbarous. So, therefore, I could find a broad tent home here. So I definitely thought that things needed to be shaken up. I was probably more interested in the idea of left regroupment as a way to shake things up. So take the existing strands of, let's say, democratic socialism, post-Leninism, post-Maoism, like a lot of these traditions, I think, converged with different styles, different histories, but there wasn't a lot of difference between the politics of the post-Maoist groups like Freedom Road. They were a little bit softer on the Democratic Party than I think most of us were in DSA, CCDS, the Communist Party, DSA. I think there was broadly some of the people around Make the Road and other kind of like constellations of activist forces, the left-wing ones. I think there was enough there for a broad convergence. So I thought that was a way to basically take an organization with 5,000-6,000 people, make an organization with 10,000 as a pole of attraction for other parts of the left and to be ready for the next upsurge. But I thought that a lot of the project of DSA and a lot of the project of Jacobin was keeping alive socialist ideas for a new generation to be useful many years in the future. Like I definitely saw the resurgence of socialism in part because, I thought that the materialist worldview informed by Marxism was based in objective reality, right? I thought that also, there was a contradiction between those who have power and wealth and those who don't. And there's always going to be conflicts over the distribution of resources. So I knew there was going to be some sort of upsurge. I just saw it as more laying the groundwork for maybe 2025 or 2030. I think some of the early Jacobins might have joked about the year 2036, for whatever reason, as the year of our return and resurgence. And that was kind of an inside, joke for a while. I think a lot of our, passwords and other things had like, we're just 2036 exclamation point or whatever. But that was
how old will you be in 2036?
In 2036, I will be 46 years old.
Yeah, right. God. Yeah. So maybe that's why it was 2036, because you'll be old enough to be seasoned and mature and you can run for office. So let's see here. I want to ask you about the Democratic Party because the DSA, you said the DSA was harder on the Democrats than like the Maoists were. I think most Maoists would,
Yeah, I think people don't
agree with
forget
that.
The DSA didn't even endorse Obama in 2008. It just didn't make a endorsement or a statement in that election. Kind of just left to be without a endorsement, even for people in swing states. It was just
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways, you may be absolutely right. Like the supposedly more sectarian, doctrinaire, Marxist organizations within America are actually softer in a particular way on the Democrats than the DSA, which has a more direct relationship to the Democrats in my mind anyway, because of the way it was founded and what it's for. So for instance, just to tell a personal anecdote, the organization I was with absolutely hated the Democrats until it came to election time, in which case they would all just hold their nose and vote for a Democrat and argue, at least certainly with Trump, rail against how much of a threat Trump was. And therefore you had to vote for the most secure and throw your weight behind the most secure, middle of the road, safest Democrat, basically the Biden argument coming from Marxists, right? Whereas the DSA was like, we will risk short-term security in order to push the Democratic Party to the left.
Yeah, I think a lot of the official communist movement all around the world, part of their goal became self-preservation under state attacks, under public criticism, and whatever else. And I think out of that, you go from maneuvering for state power, from what obviously is from the socialist tradition, but from what Leon Blum would call the conquest of power, like proletarian forces actually taking control of the state and creating a worker state, ushering about socialism, to then you take a step back to what he would call the exercise of power, which is kind of getting into power, implementing, you wouldn't use this word, obviously, it's from the 30s. The word is much later on, but structural reforms or non-reformist reforms to get closer to the point that you could conquer power. But then ultimately, when he actually took power, what he thought he was doing was neither the conquest or the exercise of power, but merely holding power, holding power, because otherwise the far right, the fascist forces in the 30s, unlike now with Trump in the 30s, there were actually fascist forces in France, would have taken power, he thought, and would have made it all the more unlikely in the future that the workers' movement would be able to either exercise or conquer power. And I think that some of that mentality was the mentality of communists all around the world, whether in national liberation movements, sorts of broad fronts and coalitions. They subsume their identity and just hope that the goal is to create alliances between the left and center to stay alive and to fight another day. And I think there is, in certain environments, validity. It's really a tactical question to me. There is validity to that in certain environments. It might have made sense for left center alliances in a country on the cusp of fascism, or to maintain a broad enough base to prevent counter-revolution like in Chile, or whatever else. I just thought it was part of the analysis. It was hyperbole in the case of the United States, and that the biggest danger in the long run was not having a left that existed at all, programmatically or in people's imaginations or at an organizational level in their communities, and distancing ourselves from what was decrepit in liberalism, distancing ourselves from the mainstream of the Democratic Party, even if we were using the vehicles of elections, was the most important thing. So in other words, neoliberalism is part of what's creating the far right, and a short-term move to uphold the present order just makes it all the more likely that when it falls apart, which it will, the right is going to be the only oppositional force. And I still believe that. I'm still happy I didn't canvass for Hillary Clinton or vote for Hillary Clinton or vote for Biden, because in part, I think the crisis of the Democratic Party has to be seen as an opportunity for us, not something to prevent.
Yeah. Okay. So what you just said about the crisis of the Democratic Party kind of hits a note for me, because when I became like in 2016, I was not that enamored with Bernie Sanders until kind of after he had lost to Hillary. But 2020, I did kind of, for the first time in my life, I gave money to a political candidate. Like that's how bad it was for me. And it was Bernie. And I hoped that him almost getting the nomination would cause a crisis within the party and would like do damage to the Democratic Party. That was what I wanted to see. Was that what you wanted to see come out of the Bernie Sanders campaign, or did you want him to get the nomination? How did you think of what would be successful?
I initially thought of it was just carving out an opposition movement. So actually, I was part of a draft Bernie Sanders movement before he came in. But if you read what I wrote at the time, including the thing I wrote the day he announced, so obviously I had pre-written it, my goal was for him to be a mainstream socialism in the U.S. rhetorically, be a voice in kind of a left populist sense for discontentment with inequality, and to help us organize on the outside as a result. And I think we actually accomplished those tasks. But, I'm not sure if I actually wrote this down, but my goal was to have him beat out O'Malley. I wanted him to be a very distant second place. That was like the dream, my ambition. Obviously, when it happened, you get greedy at a certain point. You're at the blackjack table and you're like, well, I really wanted to make, $20 and go the hell home. But, now that I made $20, might as well try to make this 40. And, so I think we got a bit greedy, and we, as in kind of socialists as a whole, who supported him with the Sanders campaign compared to the initial goal. But I did think that the goal was to create a distinct oppositional profile for the left. Like, we were in a country without a left, and we needed to create the left. And since we had hollowed out institutions in civil society, since the workers' movement has been all but defeated, and trade unions have been all but defeated in the U.S., we had to use this kind of left populist tactic of running in elections, using the mass media, using communicative tools, not because we thought that was a route to power in a direct sense, but because we thought that was a way to unblock and re-energize politics in the country.
Why was Bernie Sanders superior in your mind to like someone like John Edwards?
Well, Bernie Sanders, I mean, I think I actually supported Edwards and
I was for Edwards too, and but not deeply or anything. But like, it seemed to me that we've seen these like in almost every election. There's somebody who kind of vaguely talks like an old New Deal Democrat. There's someone who comes along and wants to, like the Two Americas with John Edwards, or Dennis Kucinich might have been someone like that before. What was it about Sanders that made him more important in your mind before Trump in 2016?
I think there was a far sharper level of class delineation in what he was expressing. This is someone who, it's like actually this is sometimes reminds me of the history of the Civil War. If you know a little bit about the Civil War, but just like the 5-second version, is a war about slavery. If you spend a couple years learning about it in high school, you say, oh, it's pretty complicated. It's about 5 different factors and whatever else, Then if you're a real student of history and you spend years of your life poring over this stuff and, whatever else, then you say, oh yeah, it was about slavery. I feel like with Sanders, he was someone who was a man of the left and a man of the far left. This was someone who was an elector for the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1980s, who did, as Mayor of Burlington, even like later on when he had moved into more mainstream politics, a more important figure, express solidarity with the Cuban Revolution and become involved with solidarity work with struggles in Nicaragua and El Salvador. This is someone who has views of the far left. He's modulated some of those views, but I think there's this old left common sense, class centric quality to him. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something about the fact that he came from this old generation, the left, and he learned the right rhetoric to communicate with people that made him more attractive to people. And I would actually contrast that rhetoric and that very distinct worldview that he would have with the rhetoric and communication of, let's say, AOC and a lot of, particularly AOC, but other members of the squad too, whose rhetoric is much more of the academic, heavily identitarian rhetoric of the more recent campus left, which I think is very different than Bernie. But yeah, so I think it's just a matter of degrees. And the fact that he called himself a socialist, I think that was actually significant. It wasn't just that he decided to call himself a socialist. This is someone who had to call himself a democratic socialist because he couldn't escape decades and decades of identification since he was in Yipsel, identification as a socialist. And I think that mattered because you're tying your class-centric worldview, your class struggle worldview, with an ideology that's outside of the American mainstream. And those ingredients combined with having a younger, more kind of confrontational base, those all combined by saying, oh, Bernie was distinct and different than the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of it owed to his simplicity and focus on class. And a lot of people want to argue that his rhetoric didn't change in the next election cycle, but I think it's very clear that he adopted a lot of the identitarian trappings of the Democratic Party, in part because he wanted to win over people in Democratic Party primaries, and Democratic primaries often are like an interest group based fight. You don't say one universal common sense message. You instead tailor your language to every single, sometimes made up constituency and so-called communities, because those NGOs are who kind of makes the Democratic Party go.
Yeah. Do you think that he could have gotten the nomination then if he hadn't changed his rhetoric in 2020?
probably would have played out similarly. I think in a way, Biden actually there's some weird parallels to him and Sanders in terms of communication styles. They both seem like men out of different eras. And I think that older Democratic voters actually like that. So you have a lot of people who were first preference was Sanders, second Sanders preference was Biden, and vice versa. So I actually think there was something common in their communication style, in part because Biden had to learn politics in an era where you had to talk to trade unions and you had to be relatable, as opposed to now when you could just be, put into a safe deep blue district and, put on your path to power. Like, it's unclear to me that Kamala Harris has ever built a real base.
Well, yeah, I don't disagree. Okay, so I want to bring up this. We're getting towards the end of our conversation. Unfortunately, I should have you back if you have time. But Adolph Reed was recently interviewed on This is Revolution, which is a podcast that I know Jason and Pascal. And he admitted that while he had supported the Sanders campaign with the hope of building a kind of long-term movement out of it, that would last, to create kind of new institutions for class-based struggle out of that movement, that in fact that was not the result of the Sanders campaign, that no new institutions or movements arose after the Sanders campaign. He didn't explain exactly why, but I have a theory as to why. It's because of it would be basically because of the funding mechanism that Sanders used, and the way his funding was tied to the Democratic Party. The lists that he created were tied to the Democratic Party, I think, and there was no, all of the what he built up in his campaign became assets of the Democrats after, and that was probably always going to be the case. So, if we just ignore the fact that some people thought that he should, was on track to get the nomination, and it seemed in 2020 to me, not maybe having paid close enough attention the first time around, that he was closer. I mean, remember?
I think there was at least a week and a half where I thought he probably had it.
Nate Silver told me. Nate Silver said he had a 99% chance of getting the nomination. And I knew Nate wasn't some Bernie crat or anything. So, but it turned out Nate's not good at this stuff. So
what I like about Nate Silver is he just makes take. I'm a huge sports fan. I grew up listening to New York sports radio. So you would just have a host just say, Mike and the Mad Dog, just say the stupidest things, be proven wrong, and just power through. The next day they're back on the radio and nothing happened. So that's Nate Silver. He's drive time, sports talk radio.
And somehow every time he does it, every time he comes forward, I'm like, oh, I got to listen to him because he's smart. But anyway,
that's deep unconscious biases. There's some consultants I could talk to you. I could connect you with about that.
Oh yeah. That's why you think I have deep unconscious biases in Nate's favor. That's why
I think so.
Probably. So what do you think accounts for this failure of the Sanders campaign in the way that Adolph Reed described it? That it didn't create a new movement.
Yeah, I think part of it was failings of Sanders himself, of not prioritizing that, and also not being that kind of leader. Like, he wasn't, but also the question is, who was he going to lead? In other words, he had built a base, because it was a left populist campaign, builds a base of voters, of people who like this individual figure and like his class struggle messaging. That's who he built. But did he really build a base of activists that had any sort of leverage or points in which they can organize? So in other words, what would have this, let's say Sanders tried to build a mass movement, he attracted, let's say, the activist 1% of his broad voting bloc. Would it look very different than what DSA is now? In other words, like a motley collection of people recruited in ones and twos, far more identity focused than most Americans, far more college educated, far more just fringe and prone to splitting, than the base. Would it actually have had this mass root? Like, where was the big trade union that had 1 billion, militants ready to fight for Sanders and ready to, help implement his program? It wasn't that kind of thing. It was a fleeting attempt that really only would have worked, because it was this left populist attempt, only would have worked with state power, only would have worked with like maybe a general election run, even a longer period of time, and the ability to use a greater bully pulpit to direct people to mass action, to kind of unblock the state in a way that, let's say, even Trump to some degree, like, say what you will. Obviously, I'm not a supporter of the January 6th insurrection, or whatever you want to call it. But what was that? Like a president trying to do a bad thing, but trying to use mass action to create the results in the state machinery that he wanted. And I think that's what a Sanders administration could have, in theory, been like. That's what the type of action that you could have gotten. I don't think you could have generated a party beyond the left with just the activist base of the Sanders campaign. And honestly, I'm not sure any of us would want to be a part of whatever would have emerged given the actually existing left. So how do you create a left with actual rootedness in the working class? I think that's a much longer term project, and that should be where we're starting. Not can we create a bigger DSA or whatever else, but can we create a more rooted left?
But when this was happening and during the Sanders campaign, you and Adolf Reed were both members of the DSA, right? Did you guys talk strategically at all during that period?
No, I mean, I talked to Adolf a lot. I'm a big admirer of his work for many years, actually, way more than a decade, maybe since 2009 when we were first in touch. But probably not at a strategic level about like what DSA should do. More complaints about things that were being done on various quarters of the left, right? Right. Especially with this, I think the hyper-racialization of American politics in recent years.
Yeah, but I mean, was there a consensus amongst people who were on the left backing Sanders and through the DSA about what would be necessary for Sanders to do in order to build the movement they wanted? How quickly was it recognized? I mean, obviously, I guess we all got swept up in that Nate Silver's moment, right? We all thought there was a moment there, but how quickly did people recognize what you just said was true? And are you sure that now that are you guys having just kind of strategic conversations that you need to in order to avoid maybe the same mistake? Because, well, on the one hand, I definitely think we need to be rooted in the working class as on the left. But on the other hand, I'm not quite sure what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean just supporting trade unions right now. I mean, not that we shouldn't.
So I think it means supporting, one, making sure that our appeals are rooted at building a majority base by rooting it in common sense, material interest appeals. Then be willing to be present and to support mass working class action in many different forms. So the Yellow Vest actions in France, that was a form of working class revolt that I think socialists were involved in, and communists in France were involved in, and made sense to be involved in. Other countries, the left populist window hasn't really closed. I mean, in France, it hasn't fully closed. In other countries, it's not. It's kind of an uneven thing. In some countries, a more traditional left party and program is are making progress, like in Belgium with the Workers' Party of Belgium. So I think that rootedness to me means thinking through how to unblock one, shift politics from just this culture war terrain, which I think in part means employing in the short term populist tactics, and not because I believe in populism as a grand theory, but I believe that in this moment in American politics, when you have highly polarized, rooted identities tied to these cultural struggles, it makes sense to try to create a politics in which it's more top versus bottom and bottom versus top than left, center, and right. It's an easier terrain for us to build kind of an egalitarian movement. So even when you think about something like the recent Black Lives Matter protests, yes, they were large, but how much more disruptive would those protests have been if they were tied to an assault on the prerogatives of capital, in a very direct way? They were less disruptive, I think, than Occupy, and they were more easily co-optable, not because of some crafty elite capture, but because the demands themselves were so vague and so easily co-opted into at times what could be actually an anti-working class.
I think they were more disruptive for everyday working people than Occupy was by far, but less disruptive of the political structure of America. And okay, so my final thought or question for you, as sort of as a one publisher to another, one person working on the left to another, how do we work on the left, publish on the left, think on the left, and maintain a commitment to being strategic, which I think means being able to talk critically to each other without, sectarian splits or wars or any of that stuff. Have you encountered a lot of that as you've gone along on the left?
To be honest, I don't encounter a lot of sectarianism, which is a bad thing, and sometimes because it means that people are just incredibly apt to follow whatever the consensus of the day is. And when they do break, I think, from the social and cultural consensus of the left, they break completely from the moral and ethical portion of the left and the socialist project, which is a world without exploitation, a world without oppression, a world where we're breaking with capitalism, and we're constructing something else. We're constructing a socialist society, and it seemed to me that there's a lot of I think a lot of pressure to go along with whatever the social norms are. Whereas for me, what's helped, I think, at times avoid that temptation is just to see the left that we're trying to create is not the actually existing left, but what are we doing as publishers, as individuals, as activists, as organizers to create the left of the future? So are we engaging in opportunism today that might undermine our project tomorrow? And if we think in terms of a medium-term time horizon instead of a short-term time horizon, then why would we do some of these things? At certain moments, it might make sense to modulate and be careful with the way we express a criticism. So if there is a criticism, let's say, of the Black Lives Matter movement, one should, I think, have a caveat that a lot of people were engaged with it for egalitarian reasons. And we believe in the disruption part of it. We just, believe in kind of a more focused program, this or that, or whatever it is. So I think there's tactical modulations that I think aren't quite the same thing as opportunism or just tailing things. So there's a fine balance between all these things. I definitely think we're in a better position now than we were 10 years ago. But now that we've gotten the taste of some degree of relevance, we've gotten the taste of reaching millions of people with a class struggle rhetoric and appeals, it's hard to be satisfied. But I think, as you know, and as many of your viewers who are my age or older know, things were pretty bleak, and they could become pretty bleak in the future. I think we're on a pretty bad course now for our politics to just be completely dominated by culture war, completely polarized in just the stupidest way possible, and for the working class to be even more alienated from politics as usual.
I think you're being optimistic. I was talking to my kid today, and which, by the way, back to the Black Lives Matter things. Like, I criticize the tactics of Black Lives Matter in 2020 because I was watching a lot of these things happen through my kids who are out there, protesting and things. And I, of course, supported what they were doing in spirit, but I always was trying to direct them. And that's the same as I feel about the whole thing. But I think you're being optimistic that we're going to be able to continue to have the same problems around culture war issues and being dominated by the neoliberal kind of wing of capital. Because I look at what's happening in Ukraine, and it could be a lot worse than that. We could long for the days where we were irritated by woke takes on Twitter. But anyway, do you feel as though, do you feel a sense of emergency around Ukraine?
I disagree with the policies of the Biden administration. I think that a lot of the West has turned from the common sense policies that, let's say, guided like even German foreign policy, not particularly radical foreign policies, towards engagement with Russia and seeking some sort of solution to going along with the war. I do not think that this necessarily means there's going to be a massive escalation towards another world war or towards more U.S. interventionism. I think that I do think part of our emphasis should be on what's become a very far right regime in Russia that could unilaterally end the war, and whose presence, whose actions, the action of the right in Russia by invading Ukraine is bolstering the right in the U.S. and across the West, and this is the way it always is, right? And I think we need to focus on both sides of the equation there. But I don't want to make it seem like I'm downplaying my disagreement with the Biden administration, my opposition. I think it's a little bit tricky to mobilize mass support for an anti-war movement when there's plausible deniabilities in both Russia and the U.S. There's actually
when you say that Putin's war in Ukraine is bolstering the right in the U.S., do you mean it's helping the Trump MAGA
to me, sorry, I mean the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., NATO forces.
Oh, right. Okay, to be clear, like it's helping. Right.
It's common sense to me, and this is the argument that I think Jacobin got a lot of attacks from liberals. I got a lot of attacks because of just the common sense position of, I'm a socialist. I oppose capitalism. I oppose the division of the world into classes which have existed since the Neolithic Revolution. Is it a big surprise that I oppose the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
No, right.
This somehow became such a controversial point. There's many things to criticize DSA on, but opposing NATO is not one. And if there's a socialist party to the left of social democracy in Europe, it can oppose NATO. Quite frankly, it shouldn't exist. But the way things are going, it seems like only Ireland's going to hold out. God bless the Irish. They will probably never join NATO. If they ever join NATO, then I think I might just call it quits here on Earth. That was the last straw.
Oh, don't do that. Don't set a bar that you don't know that.
No, the Irish. I believe in the Irish. Right. Okay. Defending ourselves from counter-revolution in Cuba and Ireland joining NATO. I think those are the low bar. Like if we retreated to in all other quarters as a socialist movement, at the very least we could hang on to the socialist 1/500th of the world and a neutral Ireland.
Okay.